Good morning and welcome to the Textile Arts Council 2022 Saturday Lecture Series. I'm Kathy Cerny, Chair of the Saturday Lectures Committee. Now I would like to introduce Board Member Alice Beasley, who will introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Kathy. I want to welcome all of you to the Textile Arts Council's Annual Sinton Lecture. This lecture is the product of a generous endowment created by the Carol Walter Sinton Fund for Fiber Art Studies. It is designed to promote and expand the craft of fiber art, including by contemporary artists such as our speaker today. Artists who give us a whole new way of looking at and thinking about fiber art. I want to extend tax gratitude in particular to Carol Sinton's children, Peter Sinton and Pat Adler, who are here with us in our audience today, and who continue to support the reach and mission of the Carol Sinton Fund. We're honored to have today as the Sinton speaker, Bay Area artist and environmental activist, Linda Gass. Linda is best known for her intricately stitched paintings about climate change, land use, and water. Linda was born and raised in Southern California. She graduated from Stanford University with a BS in mathematics and an MS in computer science. But after a decade-long career in software, she returned to her true love of making art by combining her concerns for the environment into artwork that calls out the interconnection between humans and the water and land that sustain us. Her work explores how landscapes change over time, focusing on those places where destruction and renewal, wounding and healing, absence and presence overlap. Her artwork is inspired and informed by her meticulous research process, which includes the history, scientific studies, maps, and aerial photographs of a site. She works in different mediums, textiles, land art installation, and glass. In her textile work, she blends painting with quilting and embroidery techniques to create vibrant, highly textured aerial landscapes and maps, showing the human marks that affect our water resources. Linda's work has been exhibited throughout the US and in Europe and Russia at venues including the Museum of Craft and Design, the Oakland Museum, the Bellevue Art Museum, and the US Embassy in Moscow. Her work is held in many public and private collections, including the International Quilt Museum, the San Jose Museum of Quilts and Textiles, Zuckerberg San Francisco General Hospital, UCSF Hospital, and the Kapoor Center for Social Impact. She's been the recipient of numerous awards, including the prestigious Fleischacker Foundation Eureka Fellowship. Linda has a studio at the Alameda Artworks in San Jose. When she's not making art or championing environmental causes, you can find her backpacking, camping, and hiking in the wilderness areas of the West, where she finds much of the inspiration for her work. I'm pleased and honored to present an extraordinary artist and a friend, Linda Gass.
Thank you, Alice, for that really nice introduction. And thank you to the Textile Arts Council for inviting me to give the annual Sinton Lecture. I feel incredibly honored. And big thanks to all of you for being here today, both those of you who are here in person and to everyone who's watching remotely via Zoom. I always like to begin my talks by acknowledging the watershed that I'm in. So we're gathered here today in Golden Gate Park, and I'd like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the San Francisco Dunefield watershed. This is a historical photo of where we are right at this moment in Golden Gate Park. It used to be all sand dunes. The museum is located in what is now called San Francisco, a place name that's only 245 years old. It's important to acknowledge this short history and acknowledge what a privilege it is to be on the historic land of the Yelamu and the unceded ancestral homeland of the Ramaytush Ohlone, a place holding a much longer and deeper history where families have raised children and cared for the land for thousands of years. I recognize that I benefit from living and working on their traditional homeland, and I express my gratitude and respect for Indigenous elders, past, present, and future, who stewarded this land using a practice of reciprocity. The title of my talk is Using Beauty and Textiles to Look at Hard Environmental Realities. I will show you my recent artwork and how beauty plays an important role by diving into the concepts and the research that inform my work, as well as giving you a behind the scenes view into how I make my work. So I'll be showing 5 series of work today, all addressing the intersection of climate change and water. And all my artworks are very local to the San Francisco Bay Area. However, the concerns that they address apply worldwide. I use soft, comforting materials and the emotional power of visual storytelling to evoke the chaos of climate change and environmental damage. And it's my hope to raise attention and inspire people to change their behavior before it's too late. So I'm inspired by the connections between humans and the water and the land that we need to survive. And I work primarily in textiles, usually painting bird's eye view landscapes on silk, which I then stitch on a sewing machine to add more design and texture. I'm interested in how landscapes change over time, and climate change will have a significant impact, whether it's sea level rise, wildfires, or how much snow falls in our mountains. My artwork begins with an environmental issue, usually related to water. Once I've selected an issue, I do extensive research to learn more by doing site visits, reading science and history publications, and seeking out historical and present day maps and photographs. I sometimes collaborate with scientists, but most of the resources that I use are settler and colonial in nature. So I've started working with local indigenous tribes to incorporate their knowledge of what the indigenous landscape once looked like. My research process is integral to developing the concept for my artwork, and it helps me refine my choice of subject matter and also the composition. I'm not exactly sure how I got interested in water issues, but I think the concept entered my mind subconsciously because of growing up in Los Angeles. My mom's from Luxembourg, a tiny European country where it rains a lot. And she tried to raise my sisters and me with the superstitions of her childhood. So every night we had salad with dinner, and because salad doesn't keep very well, we were told that if we didn't finish the salad, it was going to rain tomorrow. Well, everyone in Los Angeles knows that it hardly ever rains, so we couldn't take her threat very seriously. But that planted a nagging question in my mind because I was surrounded by swimming pools, palm trees, lush lawns, and golf courses that needed a lot of water, and it never rained. So where did that water come from? Something didn't make sense to me. And then one day I learned that Los Angeles is really a desert and it imports lots of water from far away to make it look green. And I haven't been able to let go of that since. As general research, I spend a lot of time during the summer seeking out the headwaters of the streams and rivers that we rely on for survival. And they're always located in the most beautiful places I've ever seen. The wilderness is also where I go to find magic and refresh my perspective on life. It's vast and unforgiving, and it really reminds me of my place in the universe. You can only reach these headwaters by foot, and it usually takes several days to get there. So I do a lot of backpacking. And climate change is now impacting my backpacking trips, with intense wildfires becoming one of the additional challenges that I face when I'm in the backcountry. This photo was taken in July 2018 while I was hiking on the Pacific Crest Trail just east of Redding, California. and we saw smoke and an ominous pyrocumulonimbus cloud from our campsite. 2 days later, this was the air that we woke up to. Visibility was about 200 feet and the air was seriously unhealthy to breathe. After that summer, I started carrying an emergency N95 respirator mask in my backpack. At the time, I had no idea this would become a scarce and essential resource, both for COVID today and for local wildfires. So the first series of artwork I'm going to talk about is entitled Urban Power versus San Lorenzo Creek, What's Next? This triptych of artwork shows how we've modified our local urban streams and questions the implications of that for dealing with climate change and the need for groundwater storage. Artworks show how the creeks have changed through time, focusing on 3 different time periods. The artwork is based on San Lorenzo Creek, which is located in the town of San Lorenzo in the East Bay. I've highlighted it here in red on the map. This is San Lorenzo Creek today. The creek channel is completely encased in concrete. Historically, the creek was a source for groundwater recharge. Water from the creek would seep through the gravel stream bed to the aquifer below. I wanted to show the creek in its original unmodified state, how it changed during the settler agricultural era, and then what it looks like today. So I researched historical maps, aerial photographs, and satellite images for the 3 time periods that I wanted to focus on. And I found this map of the San Francisco Bay area from 1873 that shows what the creek looked like before human interventions. Now I'm going to zoom in on San Lorenzo. And now I'm going to highlight San Lorenzo Creek for you. So you can see what the original meandering creek looked like. And here is an enlargement of it so you can see it even better. So the next time period I was interested in was the post-World War II era, when the area was in transition from agriculture to suburbs. And I found this 1946 aerial photograph of San Lorenzo in the US Geological Survey archives. And it reveals a lot about what happened to the creek. So I want to orient this photograph to be the same as the orientation on the 1873 map. And I'll highlight the same section of creek that I'm focusing on in the artwork. So here's an enlargement of the creek section so you can see it better. The creek still meanders, but it's not as meandering. It's much more straight than before. The farmers straightened it out to make it easier to work their fields. But the creek hadn't yet been encased in concrete, which allowed it to flood over the farmlands during heavy rains. And the farmers actually liked this because it spread nutrients over their soil. But one thing I want you to notice, though, is the suburban development in the lower left corner. As you might imagine, those houses did not like the creek flooding over, which was what led to the concrete flood control channel being built between 1954 and 1961. Finally, I wanted to understand what the creek looks like today from the bird's eye point of view. So I used Google Earth to get a satellite image of the area, and I'll highlight that same section of creek again. And you can see how much straighter the creek is. And here's an enlarged view of that section. There's no farm fields left. It's all suburbs now. So putting all 3 sections together, the 1873 map, the 1946 aerial photograph, and the satellite image from 2019, you can really see how much the creek has been modified over the past 2 centuries. And this is what's been done to all of our local creeks. So I know there's a lot of makers out there in the audience. So now I'm going to take you behind the scenes and show you my artistic process. I chose to orient the artwork vertically, so I'm going to reorient these. So the work I'm best known for are my stitch paintings on silk, and that's the medium that I used for this artwork. Before I begin painting, I make detailed drawings based on my research. And then I paint small watercolors to come up with the color scheme for the artwork. Here I'd like to point out that I didn't have any photographs to inform what the landscape around the creek looked like in 1873. But luckily, when I was doing my research, I found a paper published by the San Francisco Estuary Institute about the historical ecology of San Lorenzo Creek. By translating journals from Spanish explorers and missionaries, they were able to confirm that the landscape was willows and oak savanna. So I created a bird's eye view landscape based on those descriptions. So then I enlarge my smaller drawings to actual size using pencil, and then I draw over it with a Sharpie marker to make it easier to see when I have to trace it onto the silk. In order to paint on silk, I need to stretch it very tightly using a wooden frame. And this keeps the dyes from pooling and running everywhere. I then trace the drawing onto the stretched silk with a special pencil that stays on the silk long enough for me to make my painting, but it eventually washes out. I use liquid transparent dyes, and I mix all of my colors from the primary cyan, magenta, and yellow. And I use black to make darker shades, and I dilute the dyes with water to make lighter shades. This is a dye mixing chart I made using the primary colors. When I want to mix a specific color, this chart helps me figure out the proportions of the primary colors that I need to use. Silk painting is really similar to watercolor painting if you've ever done that. You paint the light colors first and the dark colors last. And that's because a light color will not show up on top of a darker color because the dyes are transparent. So I have to really strategically plan how I'm going to do my paintings. These are my brushes. Most are regular watercolor brushes, but you'll see in the lower right corner, there's some special Japanese brushes that I use for blending colors together into a smooth gradation. This is my studio in San Jose at the Alameda Artworks, where I make my textile artwork. And you can see the bottles of dyes and other tools stored in the wire shelves behind me. The silk dyes bleed into the fabric, similar to what happens if an ink pen leaks on your shirt. It just keeps spreading and spreading. So I use a resist to create boundaries for the dyes. The resist is similar in consistency to white glue, and I apply it from a squeeze bottle with a really, really fine tip. And when it dries, it acts as a barrier to contain the dye. So then I build up multiple layers of dye and resist to create my final painting. Here I had first painted a thin line of yellow dye, and now I'm applying the resist. And once the resist dries, I test for leaks by painting on water. If there's a leak, the water's clear and it won't ruin my painting. Here you can see a leak, and then there's also another one. Yeah, right there. After I've repaired the leaks and tested them again, I start applying the dyes. This is a time lapse of me painting the creek with different colors of blue dye. You can see how the resist is acting as a barrier to contain the dyes. And this is more time lapse of me painting the landforms and the vegetation around the creek. And as a final step, I paint on black textile paint to create the shadows in the creek banks and shadows from the trees and the bushes. When I'm done with the painting, I make a sandwich with a white silk backing on the bottom, a layer of fluffy material called batting, and then my silk painting on top. In preparation for sewing, I basted the layers together with very small safety pins. The pins leave permanent holes in the fabric, so I strategically place them in areas where I know I will stitch with my sewing machine. I then stitch the painting on my sewing machine using colored embroidery thread to create a highly textured sculptural landscape. I use a capability that exists on all sewing machines called the free motion embroidery or darning feature, where I drop the feed dogs and I guide the fabric under the needle instead of letting the machine guide the fabric through it. And here are the finished artworks. This artwork questions how we manage our local creeks. We've contained our creeks in concrete, and we can no longer recharge our groundwater. Since storing groundwater is more important than ever in the face of climate change, what changes do we need to make to manage our creeks more wisely in the future? The next artwork is about one of the most visible effects of climate change, which is sea level rise. I made this triptych for a solo exhibition that opened at the Museum of Craft and Design in late 2019, just before the 2020 shutdown. Was anybody here on the Textile Arts Council tour of the exhibit on January 30th of 2020? Yeah, I see a couple of hands raised. That was really wonderful that you came. So the museum's located in the Dogpatch neighborhood of San Francisco, and the director of the museum asked me if I could make an artwork that would show how sea level rise could affect their location. And this is what I made. So sea level rise is caused by two factors. One is an obvious one, which is the melting of land ice as the earth warms. And the second one is less obvious, but it's the thermal expansion of water. As the ocean warms, it expands in volume. So already sea level has risen by 7 to 8 inches since 1900. And the rate has increased in recent decades to about 1/8 of an inch a year. And we can really see the effects of this rise during high tide events in the winter, which are called king tides. And so this photograph is a really good example of where you can see the water in San Francisco Bay flowing over the seawalls during a king tide event. One of my favorite resources for understanding sea level rise is published on the website of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, referred to as NOAA. Their sea level rise viewer shows the effect of rising sea levels on any place in the United States. When the Trump administration started removing climate change publications from government websites, I was alarmed that I might lose this resource. So I took screenshots just in case it disappeared. And thankfully it never did. So I'm going to walk you through the screenshots I took for San Francisco, showing the impact of 1 to 10 feet of sea level rise. You can see that the impact of sea level rise is pretty subtle until we reach a level of 3 feet. And that starts impacting San Francisco on the eastern side. At 5 feet, you start seeing significant impact in other parts of the city. And the eastern side is even more impacted. It became clear to me that the areas of San Francisco around the Dogpatch neighborhood are going to be the hardest hit by sea level rise. And so it felt really appropriate to focus on that since that's where the Museum of Craft and Design is located. So now I'm going to zoom in on the Dogpatch area and repeat the sea level rise sequence so you can get a more intimate sense of what happens. I've highlighted where the museum is located in magenta. Although the museum is spared from sea level rise, much of the surrounding neighborhood is not. For the final installation, I chose to make a series of 3 artworks, one showing the present day sea level, and the other 2 showing 3 and 6 feet of sea level rise. And I chose these amounts based on the scientific projections released in 2018 by the California Ocean Protection Council, which is a state-appointed science and policy advisory team. The projections for 2050 show a modest increase by 1 foot. However, by 2100, the likely projections are between 3 and 6 feet. So if carbon emissions fall significantly, we'll only have 3 feet of sea level rise. But if we continue at current levels, we're going to have 6 feet. So those were the 2 alternatives that I chose to show in the artwork. So now I'm going to share some of my process that I used to make this series of 3 artworks. Because the cityscape was identical in all 3 artworks, I decided to make one silk painting for the Bay cityscape and then try a technique that was new to me, which was to scan that silk painting and modify it in Photoshop and then print those artworks on silk digitally. So here I am showing some of the steps in creating the base silk painting where I build up layers of resist and dye, working from light to dark. And I'm using a technique called linear underpainting where I will carefully paint dye onto the silk first and then put resist on top of it so that I don't have unwanted white lines showing in my final painting. And then this is a series of photographs I took over a period of 2 weeks showing my progress on the silk painting assembled into a time lapse. So you can get a sense of how I build up the layers of dye and resist. Once the painting was done, I scanned it at high resolution, and then I used Adobe Photoshop to modify the image to show 3 and 6 feet of sea level rise by adding a transparent blue layer to show where the flooding occurs. In the interest of time, I'm not going to do an actual Photoshop demo, but I'm going to walk you through some of the steps I went through in Photoshop to create the 6-foot version of the artwork. Because sea level rise will also increase the depth of the bay, I wanted to make the bay a darker shade of blue. So I started with the original scanned image using Photoshop. I darkened the water. Then I took that NOAA screenshot layer and I scaled it to the proper size and aligned it with my artwork to use as a guide for shading the flooded areas in Photoshop. And then I wanted to see the painting underneath, so I made the NOAA image slightly transparent. And then I used Photoshop tools to paint in the flooded areas, and this is the final image. So I created these 3 digital files in preparation for printing on silk on a large format digital printer. And here's one of the Photoshopped images being printed on paper-backed pre-treated silk. The pretreatment bonds the printer inks to the silk, and the paper makes it possible to run it through the printer. So I'm going to share a few videos of stitching the artwork. This is a slow motion video of a special attachment to my sewing machine called a walking foot. When I'm stitching long straight lines, I like to use the walking foot because it keeps multiple layers from sliding around by advancing the top layer of fabric while the feed dog underneath advances the bottom layer of fabric at the same time. And this is a time lapse of how I stitch the parallel lines in the pavement areas of the cityscape using the free motion embroidery foot and guiding the fabric under the needle. There's no way I stitch this fast. And here's one of the real-time video of me stitching one of the grass areas. So this is more like the speed. And after I'm done with all the stitching, I hem the artwork by hand before I mount it onto the frames. And here's the final stitched artwork. And you can see the changes in each painting caused by sea level rise and all the pattern and texture that was introduced by the sewing. Next, I'm going to show you an artwork that examines the consequences of climate change and the past policy of suppressing forest fires. This artwork is not only about wildfire, it's about water as well. It highlights the impact that the Rim Fire had on the Tuolumne River watershed that 2.4 million people in the San Francisco Bay Area rely on as their drinking water. In the Pacific Northwest, they have rainforests, but here in the Sierra, we have fire forests. Fire is a natural part of the life cycle of healthy forest ecosystems, and many species rely on fire for survival, like this giant sequoia in Sequoia National Park. It's common to see burn scars like this on living trees. And this is what a healthy wildfire looks like. It's burning low to the ground, burning fallen old trees and dry underbrush, and clearing thick growth to allow sunlight to reach younger trees. But for over a century, we thought that we were saving the forests by not allowing them to burn. In the words of Dr. Mark Finney of the Missoula Fire Sciences Laboratory, we've taken an ecosystem that was sustained by fire and turned it into one that is destroyed by fire. So if you combine climate change-induced drought, high air temperatures, and an abundance of fuel from decades of fire suppression, you get a mega fire like the Rim Fire that burned so hot and fast, it consumed entire trees. The fire was started by a hunter's illegal campfire near the Rim of the World Vista Point on August 17, 2013, during the hottest part of the summer and 2 years into a significant drought. This photograph was taken on August 22nd, 5 days after the Rim Fire began. I was on a bus to Yosemite Valley to begin a backpacking trip on the John Muir Trail. It was the first time I ever saw a pyrocumulonimbus cloud. These clouds are formed by intense heating of the air from a very hot wildfire. As this hot air rises, it cools and condenses the moisture in the air into a cloud formation. Pyrocumulus Pyrocumulonimbus clouds look really different from cumulonimbus clouds. To me, they look like the aftermath of an explosion. This map shows how quickly the fire grew. It expanded to nearly 400 square miles in just over 7 days. It took more than 2 months to fully contain. Until 2020, it was the largest recorded wildfire in the Sierra. But now the Creek Fire has surpassed it at 594 square miles. This shaded map shows the area of the entire Tuolumne River watershed, and the rim fire is outlined in red in there. And you can see that 96% of the fire was in the watershed of the Tuolumne River. There are long-term impacts of this fire. Water quality's been impacted by ash, fire retardant, and soil erosion. Some of the severely burned areas will never recover to forests, which changes the character of the watershed forever. This map shows how much vegetation was burned within the rimfire boundary. The red represents the most severely burned areas and accounts for almost 40% of the total area. And many of the red areas are directly adjacent to the Tuolumne River and its tributaries. This is what a severely burned area looked like 2 months after the fire started. There's nothing green left. Conceptually, I wanted to focus on the areas that were severely burned. So I began by tracing the areas on the vegetation burn severity map that were red. Here you can see the completed tracing still on top of the colored map. And then this is the final result. I wanted to use the language of maps to show how the watershed had been severely burned. So I pieced together 12 7.5-minute topographic maps for the area. I then scaled up the tracing that I did of the severely burned areas and placed that over the maps. And then I traced the topographic lines only in the areas that were severely burned, using the rationale that now that the vegetation is completely gone, you can clearly see the topography. So this is a close-up of the drawing for a small portion of the artwork. So you can see the topo lines that I traced in one of the severely burned areas. And then I transferred my drawing onto black silk, and I stitched them on the sewing machine using blue thread for the Tuolumne River and its tributaries, and light gray thread for the topographic lines. The boundary of the fire is shown by the dashed stitched line, and the burned areas that weren't severely burned are stitched with meandering stitches in black thread to create a chaotic surface. I don't know how well you can see it here. It's black on black. And then the areas outside of the fire boundary are stitched in orderly grid lines. So this is the entire artwork where the affected watershed has been divided up into 12 squares. The blue thread really comes alive against the black fabric and showing the rivers and the reservoirs. And the abundance of light gray topographic lines highlights just how much of the landscape was totally reduced to ash. 1 year after the fire, I revisited some of the severely burned areas. Many of the burned trees in the national forest were logged in what was called a salvage logging effort to harvest the wood for timber. While this brought a nice temporary boost to the logging companies and local communities, it robbed the forest of the ecosystem benefits of the deadwood's role in regenerating the forest for future generations. But I was encouraged to see a variety of new saplings growing up from the charred landscape. So I want to go back to this view of the burned forest because if you look near the center of the photo really carefully, there's a surprise. I know it's hard to see, so I'll circle it here. And now I'll show you a closer view. It was a real surprise and delight to see this random piece of art in the burned log forest. I have no idea who made it and would love to know if there's any particular significance to the chairback style. So I want to go back to this photo of the burned forest from 2014 one more time to show you some re-photography that I did in 2019. So watch closely as this landscape fades into the 2019 landscape. This is the same area 5 years later. Sadly, the chair is gone. However, the forest is starting to grow back. But you can see how long it's going to be before it looks anything like the forest that was there before. This next artwork is entitled Someday There May Be No More Snow. And it's about the decrease of Sierra snowpack that's happened during my lifetime. Historically, the mountain snowpack has served as California's largest water storage, and the state's entire system of dams and reservoirs was designed with this in mind. In spring, the snowpack starts melting and slowly releases water throughout the summer to replenish the reservoirs. Climate change is causing warmer winters, which in turn is reducing the snowpack because more of the moisture is falling as rain instead of snow, which results in less water during the summer months. The California Department of Resources carefully keeps track of snow measurements at different locations throughout the higher elevations of the state, which are called snow courses, and they're shown as the dots on this map. Snow survey personnel go to the snow courses on a monthly basis during the winter to measure the snow water equivalent, or SWE, of the snowpack using special snow coring tubes. This photograph was taken on the 1st of April, which is an important date for water managers because historically that's when the snowpack is at its peak. And then the extracted core samples are then weighed to determine the snow water equivalent. And once the snow core is weighed, it's converted to inches of snow water equivalent, and where each ounce of weight is 1 inch. So in order to make the artwork, I needed accurate data. And I found the raw data for the water content of the snowpack in the publicly available California Department of Water Resources database. But there were gaps in the data, and I wasn't sure how to calculate an accurate average. So I reached out to a local weather guru who connected me with a team of climatologists from the Western Regional Climate Center in Reno, Nevada. And they analyzed the raw data and gave me this spreadsheet with the year, the April 1st snow water equivalent, and the difference from the average. The data they gave me is for the years 1950 through 2019. And the data starts in 1950 because that's when the state started keeping the most consistent snow records. So now I'm going to walk you through my process of what I did with the data and how I experimented with different ways to present it in the most visually compelling way. So I began with a standard column graph, and I show the average line there in red. And so this graph clearly shows the wild fluctuations in snowpack in California. We have very few normal years. For as long as humans have been keeping track, flood and drought have been the norm in California. But how much flood or drought we get is what's changing. However, this chart didn't convey the decrease in a visually obvious way. So my next idea was to color code the columns, blue for above average years and brown for below, to see if that would make the trend more visible. Once again, the graph emphasized the fluctuations, but it didn't convey an obvious decline. So next, I tried a chart showing the difference from the average as negative and positive values, also color-coded. This conveyed the trend, especially in the last decade with the 5 years of severe drought. And although there were a couple of bountiful above average years, they weren't nearly as impressive as previous decades. So I'm adding these red arrows to emphasize the downward trend that I see in this data. So I further modified the design by coloring the columns with a gradation from either white to blue or brown, which makes it easier to compare years that aren't exactly adjacent to one another. And this is the actual artwork made from the data. I wanted the artwork to have a fragile quality to it, so I chose to make it out of thread lace. And I chose a curved shape for the columns to evoke the shape of the snow coring tubes. So now I'm going to show you the process of making it. All of the techniques that I used in making this were new to me, so I had to do a lot of experimenting to get it right. The lace is made by stitching a network of threads on dissolvable embroidery stabilizer. So here I am stitching spirals that are symbolic of water for the blue above average columns. To ensure the lace holds together after the stabilizer is dissolved, I had to make sure that the thread stitches overlapped in an interlocking grid manner. So here I am stitching wavy lines, symbolic of dry earth, for the brown below average columns. All of the designs are guided by my hands. They're not programmed into the sewing machine. And I change thread colors to create the gradation. So once the stitching's done, the stabilizer is removed by dissolving it in water, leaving only the thread lace. It takes about 10 minutes for the stabilizer to fully dissolve. And then you can see how the interlocking network of threads creates a strong lace that keeps its shape. So how did I turn the thread lace panels into rigid curved shapes? I used a fabric stiffener called Paverpal. I applied it with gloved hands and massaged it into the thread lace. You want to apply just the right amount, not so much that you clog the holes in the lace, but enough to stiffen the lace so that it'll hold its shape. Once the whole piece of lace is covered with fabric stiffener, I form it on acrylic tubes that were wrapped in freezer paper. The tubes approximate the diameter of the snow coring tubes that were used for the survey. And then I let it dry on these tubes. And once it's dry, it holds its shape. So the next problem to be solved was, how do you attach thread lace to the wall so that the hanging mechanism doesn't show? I really wanted this artwork to appear as though it was floating off the wall. So here's how I chose to solve it. I used tiny, super strong neodymium magnets to attach to metal nails. I've included a penny for scale so you can see how tiny they are. Paint the nails to match the wall color. Then I glued the magnets to the thread lace. And then I hammered the nails into the wall, and the magnets hold the thread lace to the nails. So the next problem to be solved was, how do you consistently hammer nails into the wall at a precise location, exactly perpendicular to the wall, and the nail has to stick out exactly 1 1/4 inches. So here is my solution: to create a wood block guide that's 1 1/4 inches thick with a groove that was just wide enough for the nails. And then here I am installing the artwork at the museum using the guide that I created. So here are all 132 nails hammered into the wall. And I actually really like this on its own. It's given me ideas for future artwork. And the moment of truth came when I had to attach each thread lace column, praying that I had precisely glued the magnets and put the nails in the wall so they lined up exactly. And thankfully they did. So on a final note, I take the same care in creating packaging for my artwork as I do in creating the artwork itself. The delicate thread lace columns needed to be transported, and they couldn't arrive bent out of shape. So this is one of the 4 boxes that hold the 60 thread lace columns. And this is one final view of the artwork again. And in case you're curious about where we are with the snowpack this year, a report released by the California Department of Water Resources just a week ago puts the snowpack at 8% of normal for this time of year. So it's going to be a really challenging summer. The last thing I want to share with you today is a community engaged artwork that came out of an art and science residency I did in 2015 through the Palo Alto Arts Center and Junior Museum and Zoo. I was asked to choose a local open space park to work in, and I chose Cooley Landing in East Palo Alto. It's an underserved community in the Bay Area where 13.5% of the residents live below poverty level. This is a bird's eye view of Cooley Landing today, but this peninsula land didn't always exist. 200 years ago, the area was pristine wetlands, as shown on this historical map. I pointed out where Cooley Landing would be if it existed back then. It was a favorite hunting and fishing spot for the indigenous people. And big changes began during the gold rush when it became a shipping port. A dock was built, and that was when it became known as Cooley Landing. The biggest changes happened, though, from 1932 to 1960, when it was the San Mateo County dump where they burned the garbage. The timeline of aerial photographs across the top shows how landfill created the peninsula that we know today as Cooley Landing. Unfortunately, this filled in valuable wetlands, and it contaminated the soil with lead, mercury, PCBs, and other toxins. After 150 years of industrial use, Cooley Landing is being transformed into a new open space park. The toxic landfill has been capped with 6 feet of clean soil, and native wildlife is returning to the area. As part of the residency, I worked with an art and a science teacher to do art and science activities with the community out at Cooley Landing. So we examined the environment up close with magnifying glasses and then sketched what we observed. We also examined mud and water samples under the microscope, and I was really impressed with how much life we found. One of the artworks I did at Cooley Landing was a community engaged land art installation. It began as a temporary artwork, and it's turned into a living public art installation, as you'll soon see. I went way outside of my comfort zone for this project because I usually create artwork in solitude in my studio. But this time I invited the community to work with me on creating an art installation to mark the former shoreline of Cooley Landing. Going back to this aerial photo of Cooley Landing, you can see how the landfill was built on top of former wetlands in the bay. Somewhere on that artificial peninsula of land is the old shoreline of the bay, and I needed to find a way to locate it. So I found this beautifully drawn United States Coastal Survey map from 1857, and I added the words Cooley Landing, so you can quickly see where the dock was for the shipping pier and the extensive wetlands that were around it. So I took that map and I placed it over a recent Google Earth satellite image so I could locate the former shoreline relative to present day features. And then I marked the proposed placement of the installation in blue, and I had to avoid areas that were off limits to the public. So I've zoomed in closer now to show you more details. But now came the challenge of how to locate where the installation should be in the actual landscape. And at the time I did the installation, I didn't have a good way to geolocate the shoreline with GPS technology. So I used old school techniques to guide me in placing the installation. I just used features in the landscape, such as the picnic area, trees, the stripes in the parking lot, and walkways. And it actually worked out really well. So people of all ages from East Palo Alto and surrounding communities participated in creating the installation. This little guy was 3 years old. On the day of the installation, I marked the former shoreline with landscape stakes and orange flagging tape. And then people from the community helped me hammer in the blue survey whiskers along this line using 5-inch nails. Families and individuals participated. The entire installation was built during 6 different days in July of 2015. This is a city council member from East Palo Alto who showed up in a suit and tie. So here's a view of part of the final temporary installation. It's over 400 feet long, and it's made of 2,000 plastic survey whiskers. Now, some of you might be wondering why I use plastic, such an environmentally questionable material. Well, I chose the survey whiskers for several reasons. 1, they're durable. 2, they don't present a tripping hazard. 3, the bright blue colors suggested water. 4, they're really easy to install and remove, and I plan to reuse them for future projects. People love the installation and they really wanted it to stay, but as an environmentalist, I couldn't leave the plastic out there. So I needed to find a new material, and I thought it would be really cool to use native plants. But I didn't know what to use, so I consulted a local restoration nonprofit named Grassroots Ecology, and they came up with the perfect suggestion. They suggested a California native plant called juncus, and it's perfect on many levels. It looks like the survey whiskers. It's tall, dark bluish green. It stays green year round, so it'll stand out amongst the meadow grasses that are a bright yellow green in the spring and then brown the rest of the year. And it's a native plant, so it's really well suited to the climate at Cooley Landing. It's drought tolerant. And with that idea, the Living Shoreline Project was born. So I partnered with that local restoration nonprofit, Grassroots Ecology, and we got to work. During the spring and summer and fall of 2017, we invited community volunteers to plant juncus along the line of blue survey whiskers. We also worked with groups of school children, like these adorable kindergartners, who, to my great surprise, were extremely careful and so focused. And then we worked with the San Mateo County Department of Education to involve high school students from 6 local high schools. And we taught them about habitat restoration, climate change, sea level rise, and land art. So here's a photo of the baby juncus planted. Each one's marked by a blue flag. And we temporarily left some of the survey whiskers in place until the juncus grew taller. And this is the following year where the juncus grew to about a foot tall. And then this is a recent photo. It's now almost 3 feet high in places. We've named this installation the Living Shoreline Project because we're marking the former shoreline of the bay with living native plants. It's been really gratifying to collaborate with the community and another species, juncus, to create this. And at this point, nature is in charge. One more fun thing, the other day I was looking at Cooley Landing using Google Earth, and I realized that you can actually now see the installation from space. Now, some of you might be wondering, as a lover of the arts, what can I do about climate change? Well, I have good news for you. There's a new Bay Area organization that's engaging the arts sector to take action to reduce their carbon emissions. It's called Art and Climate Action, or ACA for short. And their website is artandclimateaction.org. And you should take a photo of this or write it down. Art, because you'll want it after I tell you more about what they do. Art and Climate Action was founded during the pandemic, after that Orange Sky Day that we had in September 2020. The founders were well aware that the art world is behind on taking action to reduce climate emissions, and they really wanted to do something about it. So they committed to help arts organizations, galleries, art workers, patrons, and artist studios to measure their carbon output and to provide solutions to achieve zero emissions practices. And so here are some examples of the projects that have been taken on since the group was started. They also use art to support environmental justice efforts, such as the recent A Cool Million campaign, where Art and Climate Action collaborated with another organization called For Freedoms to display climate-related artworks by 14 artists as large-scale public works on billboards to raise awareness during Earth Month. And then sales of the original artworks will support the conservation of 1 million acres of land in California. There are monthly community meetings where we cover topics such as how to measure your carbon output, or learning about a website where you can share exhibition resources such as pedestals, frames, and shipping crates to reduce waste. And this is actually one of the most efficient organizations I've ever been involved in. The meetings last 30 minutes and that's it. Like, they really last 30 minutes. There won't be any meetings over the summer because people will be traveling, but you're invited to join our meetings again when we start up in September. But all the previous meetings have been recorded and they're available on the Art and Climate Action YouTube channel, which you can get to through their website, or just search for it on YouTube. So raise your hand if you saw the incredible Judy Chicago exhibit here at the DeYoung. Yeah, several hands raised. So Art and Climate Action worked with the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco contemporary art curator Claudia Schmuckli and the Jessica Silverman Gallery to do a climate audit of the Judy Chicago exhibit at the DeYoung. And we should have the results of that audit soon. And ACA also looks forward to continuing conversations with the Fine Arts Museums in the coming months. ACA works with both large and small organizations, and we really want to connect with as many local arts organizations as possible. So if you have a relationship with a nonprofit art space or a gallery or a museum and would like to make a difference, please contact Art and Climate Action through their website. And there are people here throughout the summer, so you don't have to wait till the fall when we start our meetings again to contact. So the last thing I want to share with you today is a project to reduce waste and therefore climate impacts within our own beloved textiles department here at the DeYoung. The Textile Education Gallery upstairs has a new reusable display system that was, design was spearheaded by textile conservator Laura Garcia Vedran. She's pictured here in the center with her collaborators on the project. Laura Camarlengo, Associate Curator of Costume and Textiles on the right, and Adalberto Castrillon, Senior Museum Technician, on the left. So the requirements of textile conservation and display are often in conflict with the reuse of materials because of issues such as off-gassing, aging of materials, and dust collection. So Laura wanted to find a way to design a display system for the education gallery that was both reusable and easy to use. So she created this modular set of panels that are also magnetic. Normally, when textile fragments are displayed, they're stitched to another piece of fabric or they're carefully pinned to another piece of fabric, and it's really labor intensive. Laura wanted to use magnets to make the display process easier. She also wanted to have an easy way to put mats around the fragments to cover the frayed edges, so the mats are magnetic as well. The display boards themselves are made from a wooden board that you can see here on the right, covered with a steel sheet. And then the back of the wood is covered with an archival aluminum barrier film. And the edges are sealed with frame sealing tape to protect against off-gassing. The front of the boards were then covered with a layer of archival cotton flannel and then a conservation grade brown decorative cover that's shown in the photo on the right. You can see it wrapped around the edges of the board there. And that exterior brown cover can be easily changed out with other colors for future exhibitions. The textile fragments are attached to the boards using rare earth magnets, the same magnets I used for the Someday There'll Never Be No More Snow exhibit. If you look closely, you'll see that a strip of Tyvek keeps the magnets from directly touching the textile fragments. And then the final step is to put a mat around that. So here's a view of the final result, but this photograph really doesn't do it justice. I hope you'll be able to see this in person when the textile galleries reopen July 16th. But will you join me in showing some appreciation for Laura and the textile department by making reuse a priority in the design of these new displays? It just fantastic. So now I want to go back to my title slide and ask you if beauty can help people look at hard environmental issues we face in a way that more in-your-face artwork might not. As an artist, I consider myself a truth teller, and I try to do it in a visually appealing way to attract people to my work in the hopes that they'll want to learn more about it. And I hope to touch them emotionally so that they'll care enough to want to do something. Now more than ever, speaking truth through art and science is so important. So this brings me to the end of my presentation. In case you want to see my work in person, here are some upcoming exhibits. And I invite you to follow me on social media where I post videos and photos about what I'm up to. You can scan the QR code up here with your phone, and it'll take you to all that information and more. And so now is the time where you get to ask me questions. I don't know if I have answers, but I always enjoy hearing questions. And thank you so much for being here today.
So your title artwork, the way the waves kind of came over the land reminded me actually a lot of how San Francisco's largely built on fill also, and also removed a lot of the wetlands in the process of doing that. I know in Southern California in particular, the loss of wetlands has been more pronounced than even here. Have you seen are there any projects you know of that are trying to reclaim those wetlands at all?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So there are several projects going on in San Francisco Bay to reclaim wetlands, not from filled land because all of that's been built on, and whoever owns that property would be really unhappy if we took it down and restored it to wetlands. But sea level rise is actually going to take care of that. Interestingly enough, if you look carefully at the sea level rise impact in San Francisco, it covers back up the places that were wetlands. But in the South Bay, there are a lot of industrial salt ponds that have been constructed. And those are being, which destroyed the wetlands that were there. And those are being restored to wetlands now. There's a very large project, the South Bay Salt Pond Restoration Project, that's been taking that on. So that's a great question. Thanks.
Linda, first I want to thank you for giving us this perfect marriage between art and activism and between beauty and destruction. It took a very creative mind to bring together these soft and hard messages together in beautiful artistic work. So thank you for that. We have some questions from our Zoom audience, a lot of technique questions. One, they want to know, why are you wearing gloves when you're stitching with your sewing machine?
Ah, that's a great question. Why am I wearing gloves? Yeah, some people think the gloves are to protect my fingers from getting poked by the needle, but that's not the case. I try to be really careful and not do that. It's to protect the silk from the oils on my fingers.
And what kind of silk do you paint on? And is that white silk that you said that you were using for a backing?
Okay, so I paint on silk crepe de chine, and I paint on a heavyweight one. And then the backing silk that I use is silk broadcloth.
Okay, and just one more. The juncus plant that you were referring to, is that the one used to make coiled baskets by Native Americans in California?
So I actually don't know if juncus is one of the basketry plants, but I know that a lot of the native grasses are. It may be, but I don't know for fact.
Actually, it's not a question, but a comment. It was just very helpful for me to see when you had the two slides showing the comparison between what a wildfire should be in a fire forest and what the wildfire was after the years and years of accumulation of dead wood and everything. And the firestorm that was there versus just the, I wouldn't call it calm, but the relatively calm, just small fire sweeping through the underbrush. That was very helpful for me for understanding.
Oh, well, thank you for saying that. Yeah, that's what I'd hoped to get across, and I'm glad that you confirmed that. So.
Anything else? Well, thank you very much again. And this was really a very insightful presentation in terms of the process of doing your work, as well as your objective in terms of communicating the need to pay attention to climate change. Thank you.
Oh, well, thank you. It's really an honor and a pleasure to be here. And I'm just grateful for the opportunity to be able to share my work with you all. So thanks so much for coming.